Before we can really get into everything, I thought it might be beneficial to just talk a little bit about the whole idea of the sociology of coaching in general. What does it mean? How does it relate to what it is that you all are going to be doing? And essentially provide some background, because there is no prereq for this course necessarily of an intro to sociology class or anything like that. And so this first lecture, which is going to be by far probably one of the longest lectures at 14 slides, because again, like I said, I try to keep everything short, sweet, and to the point, but this one is going to be providing some background. And the basic starting point is that sport, like people, like society, these things are social phenomena. These sports as activities are associated with who we are, what we do, how we live, and the time period we're living in. If we're talking about the 1960s, that's very different than if you're talking about 2010, 2012, 2015, 2017, 2020, so on and so forth. The world of sport, much like technology, really just changes all the time. But what sport allows us to do is really understand culture on a larger scale. One of the ways, if you really want to understand people, is to look at the games and sports that they play. It kind of gives us a little sense of history, who they are, that type of thing, which can be important for political decisions later on down the line. And so this whole idea of sport providing kind of an entree or a window into a particular culture is very interesting. For example, the example I have here is that you look at tennis and the U.S. Open versus Wimbledon, and how, if you're familiar with tennis, those events are dramatically different. Wimbledon has a much more sense of decorum, which is oftentimes associated with kind of the aristocracy of British life. Okay, the U.S. Open's much more. It's much more of a typical U.S. sporting event. You've got the blimps flying overhead. You've got loud music. It's not necessarily played on grass. You don't have the dress code of all white as you do at Wimbledon and those types of things. And it's not saying that Wimbledon is better or worse than the U.S. Open. These things are just very different. Another example is you can look at baseball around the world, and you can look at how the game in and of itself of baseball is the same. It's the same rules, those types of things. But the interactions within the game are going to be very different if you go to, say, Japan or South Korea than those player or manager and umpire interactions that you have here in the United States. So sport is just highlighting cultural differences around the world. That's it. Sports sociology started here in the United States in the mid-1960s, which was, if you think back to that time, a lot of social upheaval. So it was about understanding what was going on in life. You had the civil rights movement and all these different things. And if you talk about 1968, and the Democratic National Convention was sort of seen as this youth cultural movement clashing with the older, more established status quo in the United States. And sports sociology kind of picked up on the excitement and wanted to understand sport as more than just a game. And they wanted to see the significance of all these different things. And so this type of inquiry was guided on this idea that sport or physical activity or recreation, or whatever you want to call it, it's an important institution, just like religion is an institution, or the institution of marriage and family, business, economics, and all these things. And if you look at it now, it was a very radical idea back then. Now we can see that the institution of sport, recreation, and physical activity is extremely important to not only American culture, but also cultures around the world. When you talk about gross domestic product here in the United States, and I know people get really turned off talking about economics sometimes and all these things, but when you look at the GDP producers in the United States, the institution of sport is number 11 out of the top 25. So it's almost you're talking about, it's arguably one of the most important institutions in the United States. All right, that means something. So and coaches are going to be associated with that institutions. We're kind of, funneling our way down to get to that discussion. But now we know sport is important. It's worthy of us trying to understand it. Well, to understand something, it's always hard to reinvent the wheel, right? So it's easier to draw from a framework, an idea, a set of assumptions that's already put together. Sociology is a tool for doing that. Sociology studies people, organizations, groups of people, their interactions. It already has concepts and theories and different ways of gathering information that are already established for hundreds and hundreds of years. So sports sociology is basically looking at the world of sport, recreation, and physical activity through this structured lens of understanding some of the basic assumptions. And the point is that we want to see, quote unquote, how these things relate to the idea of history or economics or other aspects of social life, political entities. You know, I love sports, and I'm assuming a lot of people taking this class do the same. Well, if you love sports, sometimes you can be a little myopic, and that's all you look at. You try to sit there and think about, okay, what's going on with, for me, my beloved Green Bay Packers. And it's very easy to focus on just that. Well, what goes on with the Green Bay Packers is associated with what goes on in American culture, with what goes on in the state of Wisconsin, the metropolitan area, if you want to call it that, of Green Bay, Wisconsin. It's a very, very unique town. 120,000 people, so about half the size of, well, the core city of Wichita, and they have a professional football team. That's a very, very different context. Sociology is a way for helping us to understand those relationships. So if we're going to use sociology to draw from, and it's not going to be the only thing that we use, because I'm really into social psychology, which obviously the bridge between sociology and psychology, but a sociological perspective kind of is built upon some of these basic assumptions that you see in front of you. One is that people are social. We like to do things. There's the old adage that with regards to exercise or physical activity, things like that, people get fit together and people get fat together. You gain weight or you lose weight together, and that's why a lot of people have workout partners. When you think about food and drink are very, very social things, and so even our relationship and understanding of physical activity, you having that exercise partner that's going to push you if you're going to be running a 10K on that dreary Wednesday morning where you're like, I don't want to get up, I don't know what to do. That person that can give you the push. That's an aspect of being social. Now, individuals are, for the most part, socially determined. What does that mean? Well, it means that we are byproduct of our environments. Okay, we are autonomous beings that have the ability to make choices. Okay, but there are a lot of things out there that influence the choices that we make. It's not purely a rational decision. Good example. Did I rationally choose the Green Bay Packers? No. I was 4 years old, man. There's no way that I would have sat there watching a TV at age 4 and said, this seems like I was growing up in New Mexico at the time. So it really had no bearing on it. But how did I become a Green Bay Packer fan? Well, if you think about where my mom was from, her parents were from Ireland, settled in the Chicago area. So my mom grew up Chicago Bears fan. All right, who are the big rivals for the Chicago Bears? The oldest rivalry in the NFL, the Green Bay Packers. So could it be that I was just reacting at age 4? My mom's rooting for one team, so I'm that little snotty kid that decides to root for the other team, but then actually it sticks. All right, and that kind of dovetails into this third point, is that all of these things in society, it kind of happens on a subconscious level, and these things influence how we interact day to day. I love the food that I love because I grew up in a family that loved the food that I love. I learned it. Okay, it doesn't mean, I could have gone the other way and been like, no, I love super healthy food and kale and spinach salads and stuff like that, but I didn't grow up eating like that. That's not necessarily what I dig. Fried chicken, biscuits and gravy. These are the things that I like. This reminds me of my childhood growing up. My mom used to, she was a stay-at-home mom, and she baked cakes and made cookies and stuff out of the kitchen and sold them to people in the community. And so, you know what? I love one of those good big pizza cookies, where you take the chocolate chip cookie and you make it in the big pizza pan so it's really big and round and thin, and then she would decorate it with icing. All right, all that comes from who I was then, and it's influenced who I am now. And it's that core idea, that process, that is kind of at the kind of assumption, especially for sports sociology, for who we are. Why do you like the sports that you do? Think about those people that were important in your life and think about how they impacted you. Speaking of impact, right? Here's again me trying to justify for coaches or people that want to be coaches or are interested in coaches and coaching behaviors and roles and things like that. Why do you need to understand this? We know that you're going to get the X's and the O's from mentoring, from networking, from learning on the job. Okay, but what about how you deal, how you manage with people in sport? Understanding that sport is part of something larger. It's not just who you are and those athletes on that field or on that court at that moment. Those individuals have lives and you have to be attuned to that. It doesn't mean that you have to take that into consideration every single waking moment, but you have to understand the impact that the coach, the sport, that sport organization can have on a community, a family, so on and so forth. All right, you need to understand if you're trying to grow the message of what it is that you're trying to do with your sport. Understand who participates, why they don't participate. All right, and so it's going to be this nice blend of understanding the individual, right, which is psychology, what happens between the ears, but also understanding the community, the context. I also grew up in Texas, so understanding the context of small towns in Texas and the importance high school football had, that comes from sociology. That's what we're trying to do. That's what coaches, intuitively, they pick this stuff up over time. What we're hoping is that individuals, if they learn this early on in their coaching career, it can better impact who they are and what they do with regards to this role of coaching. Just again, kind of a dichotomy of trying to parse out the difference between sociology and psychology. Soc is going to focus on the group. Structure and agency has to do with agency is the individual, okay, and how that individual operates within these large social environments. That's what structure is that we have. And so what you're trying to do is you're trying to identify trends in a population. So if we're talking about obesity rates, which is a hot topic here in the United States, that's a trend. All right. Psychology is going to focus on the internal managing of emotions, and sports psychology is going to really focus on that individual and trying to maximize human performance from a mental acumen or aspect of the particular contest, exercise, or game. There's again another definition of sociology. You can read that at your leisure. Some of the important ideas that we've already talked about sort of implicitly as we've been moving on. Micro, macro. This comes from sociology, which is just understanding that there are things bigger than yourself going on in society, in life, in sports right now. Not saying it's better or worse, just a recognition that that's going on. And then how your personal experiences fit into that society, right? Well, so if we're talking about American society, we know what that is. There's a definition. You're able to apply that and understand it. And so being able to understand how we, the individual, fit into society and our role within sports and our sport experiences, that very convoluted, complex, complicated process is called the sociological imagination. C. Wright Mills in the 1950s was saying, look, it's hard, it's not necessarily an intuitive process, but the ability to see your own private experiences as being associated with some larger opportunity or structure in society. If you understand that process, you have what he called the sociological imagination. Now, you can agree or disagree with his descriptive terminology and the name of that, but okay, why do you like the sport that you do? I told you I grew up in Texas Panhandle, eastern New Mexico, and one of my favorite sports is lacrosse. That makes no sense. Except I had neighbors growing up that were from upstate New York, and one of the very popular games in upstate New York is a game of lacrosse. They brought that game with them. There were 3 of us boys, there was 4 of them. We were neighbors, we played, you had these sticks, you could run around, hit each other with it, try to throw a ball into a net. It was wonderful, right? Well, how did that person get out there? My own personal experience of loving lacrosse is based on the fact that ConAgra transferred this particular individual out to our dusty little small town out in eastern New Mexico at the time, all right, from upstate New York out there, and they brought with them their game. So this whole idea of business and economics, having the opportunity to participate or experience a sport, that opportunity is not just you as an individual, but that is facilitated by these large things that go on in society. That's the sociological imagination. Coaches need to understand that. The NFL is currently struggling with that. When they collectively bargained penalties for recreational drug use, such as marijuana, some of the player union reps were going through and interviewing other players, and it took them a while to understand that some of these individuals that came from extremely poor and low socioeconomic status background, using marijuana, smoking weed was the way they coped with all of the violence and the just lack of structure and the very, very difficult lives around them. Okay, it's against the law in most places. We get that. But when you start to hear that individual story, all right, and then trying to connect those things, these people in the NFL, these coaches, these player reps, all these individuals in the sport are attempting to expand and grow their sociological imagination. I know sometimes this comes off as kind of preachy, but I get very excited because if you're able to do that, then you become one of the few people. General society has bits and pieces, but hasn't really truly connected this, and you can see this in terms of how we interact. They say people are, if you don't learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it again, and if you don't learn from it and you don't understand that context and how what you're doing is associated with historical problems, then you're going to repeat those same problems. Those individuals that repeat those problems suffer from a lack, a retarded, if you will, sociological imagination. That's why I like to harp on it. That's why I dig it so much, because I think what it does is it helps you to really understand this connection of people. Another way of thinking about people is the culture. Now, culture is one of those words, kind of like character, that we throw around a lot, and it's good to put a definition to it because over time we've used it so much we don't necessarily understand what the definition is. There it is. Learn patterns of thinking, behaving, and acting that are crucial for day-to-day life. All right? It's a social heritage. You learn these things. Important to a culture are values. What's a value? It's just something good. All right? Now, it's not something that you believe is good. It's that what most people in a culture or in a group believe to be good. All right? So working hard. All right, now what you consider a good work ethic and what I consider a good work ethic might actually be different. All right, so there's going to be differences in values, but we do value this idea of hard work. And think about that, what you're trying to do. A lot of people talk about sport building character, providing entree into to learning something more than just the X's and O's of football or lacrosse or basketball or ice hockey or highlight or whatever sport it is that you're into. All right? So that coach needs to understand that if their job, or if they believe their job is to provide entree and access to understanding more about culture and life and values and how to be successful, this is the reservoir of knowledge that they're going to draw from. If a value is an idea, norms are actions. All right, so we'll talk about norms and values a lot, and we kind of use them as almost like synonyms because we'll couple them together. Well, norms are what you should do or should not do in certain situations. So they're prescriptive or they're proscriptive. That's it. Okay? Now the values are going to be much more amorphous and kind of vague. So we said work ethic, right? Respect, that's a great one. Give respect. All right. The norm is, how do you give respect? How do you demonstrate respect? How do you not? How do you demonstrate disrespect, if you will? Okay, this is what you should do. This is what you should not do in certain situations. And each coach is going to be a little bit different with regards to the norms. But the norms and the values of that team are going to be associated with that coach, that school if it's intercollegiate or interscholastic athletics or something like that, that community, that state, that nation, so on and so forth. Okay? So you think we're done with culture? No. What it does, culture is basically the, I'm a big fan of, food, so stew, right? Culture is the stew pot, or the crock pot that's got everything in it, right? The values the norms, what you should and shouldn't do. These are all that's the roast. That's the carrots that are in there. That's the onions, and if you like onions, I'm personally not a fan of onions, but a lot of people like them in a stew or something. Or if you think about gumbo, all the components that you're throwing in there. And so what sport then becomes is a little tiny bowl of that larger gumbo or stew. Okay, you have American values, you have all these things that are important, that's the actual crock pot. The bowl that you take, that's sports. And the coach's job is to think about what's in that bowl and keep it in the back of their mind that that bowl came from the crock pot. It came from something larger. Sport, as they say, is a microcosm of society, just like that ridiculous analogy that I just gave you. And this was articulated by the very first real sports sociologist in textbook in 1973 by Harry Edwards, who is very, very important on the Olympic level, who is very, very important with bringing together athletes in social activism and things like that. But he talked about what's called the dominant American sport creed, and he simply said that sport provides this right here. All of these things. All right? And that sports heroes need to embody or reflect, and coaches are the same. Now, this is primarily positive, right? There are some negative things in sports, and we know that. And overzealous coaches or parents and athletes that are willing to cheat, or coaches that sanction cheating, or the coach doesn't say, hey, I want you to engage in this kind of PED use, but they give hints and provide vague opportunities and a wink and a nod here, that type of thing. So there are negative things, but from the dominant American sport creed, this list right here, this is where we get the idea that sport is positive. Or this, this was the articulation of it in a formalized way. This goes back all the way to the 1850s and that type of thing. But here in the United States anyway. But nationalism, physical and mental fitness, building character, discipline, all these things are important. And the coach needs to understand that, because their job from a societal point of view is that they should be helping to instill some of these values through normative behaviors in the day-to-day workings of their sport. Ideologies, just ways that we construct and think about the world around us. People are complicated, sports complicated, coaches, parents, everyone's trying to think about the athlete. They're thinking about sport in a very, very different way. And so when you talk about ideologies, it's just a way of trying to articulate something that's commonly held in society. All right, so white men can't jump. We know there are white men here in the United States and all around the world that can jump, and they can jump really darn high. But the stereotype is that a white basketball player isn't going to be as athletic. All right, now, who came up with that idea? I don't know, it just kind of happened, right? And so oftentimes these ideologies or stereotypes can't be pinned down to one specific person, but it's a way of thinking about and understanding what's going on in the world of sports. Now let's get to coaching here and kind of round this out and wrap this up. What is coaching? I mean, if you want to get into, the X's and the O's and all that kind of stuff, but like I've said before, this is kind of blending some of the European influence of the science of coaching, which involves the physiology of it, understanding the body, the reaction time, performance. Then there's the neuropsychology and how long it takes for the synapses to fire for individuals to understand and interpret information. And then there's the social aspect, which I really dig, is that in Europe, sports sociologists and people that have academic and consulting positions are also coaches, very successful coaches. And there's this whole kind of practice what you preach, where here in the United States, at least a lot of the coaches I've worked with over the past decade, they tend to be kind of more, aw shucks, I just go from my gut, that kind of thing. And there's sort of this reticence to, they educate themselves a lot, but they portray themselves to be kind of simple individuals. And that's very, very different than the European model. And I'm not saying it's bad. What it does, the way that we think about coaching here, is it tends to be a little bit more homespun, less analytical. And so as a result, when something bad happens, we're like, oh, I can't believe this. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, you have a coach that, there was a report of a youth coach that was, I think he was talking about 7, 8-year-old kind of peewee football players, and he was basically punching them, smacking them. And people are like, I can't believe this. And I'm like, okay, that's pretty horrific, disgusting, and abhorrent. But what qualifications did he have to have? Well, he had a car, he had a pulse, he was willing to coach football. Okay, there's not sustained education. So drawing from that European model, these are going to be some of the things that are involved in a social aspect of understanding coaching. You're gonna have to interact with a variety of groups of individuals. And these individuals have very, very, very different at times experiences. Or if they all have the same experience, perhaps your job is to give them a new perspective and experience. The social dynamics that are important to group dynamics or individual. I mean, it's always going to be group dynamics, because even if you're a coach for one tennis player or for one golfer or something like that, that's a dyadic relationship. That's two individuals, so therefore it's the smallest group dynamic possible. But nonetheless, it is a small group. And then you have these responsibilities, and this is the part that becomes difficult. Understanding the responsibilities. Who defines those? It really depends. Depends on the level of coach. It depends on the individual, and oftentimes the way that it's left here in the United States is the responsibility of what you believe is important as a coach. All these things coming together here in the United States, this is sort of setting the stage for moving forward. Is that about 10, 12 years ago, you started to have people to say, you know what? This is pretty important stuff. Maybe we ought to start looking into some tools, not just sociology, but psychology, not just sociology and psychology, but different aspects of the physiological sciences and things like that, and maybe exercise science and sport sociology and sport management. Maybe all of those things have something to offer the individual that's going to be a coach. They can focus on the structure. They can focus on the individual. They can understand how to interact with the community. They can understand that you need some academic knowledge of understanding how to gather information. One of the great things that I've been doing recently, and not doing, that sounds sort of egotistical, but I was like, okay, let's look at, data visualization like IBM Watson or something like that. And there's all this research out there that coaches want information, big data, and we're used to that with regards to Moneyball and baseball and batting average and OPS and the number of walks and all that kind of stuff. Well, that's data. That's important, and all that comes from theory, right? And so if you're going to talk about the NFL and the combine, and when it comes to drafting a player and those character flags, you can use a lot of the same ideas with regards to data and theory to make informed decisions. And that's what we're trying to do here in this particular class, is to just sow the seeds for understanding the coaching role and the sport that you're going to be a part of in some larger context. That is simply it.